Everyone, I'm back with another video. Recently, I finished watching The Rings of Power on Prime, and it got me thinking about how House of the Dragon did such a great job delivering a compelling story with interesting characters that you can connect with, and this show here did the complete opposite. Now, I went into The Rings of Power having heard some of the backlash from a significant portion of the fan base. These sort of things, while they're in the back of my mind, never impact how I view a show. There have been many times where critics or fans like or dislike something, and I'm either pleasantly surprised that it's actually good or disappointed that it didn't meet the high praise placed on it. So I went in wanting to like it because I enjoyed the original Lord of the Rings trilogy. The Hobbit films, while not as strong as Lord of the Rings, were still decent enough. So let's get into comparing the two. While I would give House of the Dragon the edge on both cinematography and sound, I don't think that the Rings of Power failed in those areas. The only thing that was a bit awkward was that there were a few times where dramatic music was playing and nothing overly significant was going on. But on a production basis, The Rings of Power was solid. Unfortunately, the world building and some of the acting and writing all contributed in sinking the series for me. House of the Dragon was smart because they started small. Fantasy elements aside, what we see is essentially a family drama, a Targaryen one, with the central players being a father and a daughter, and then Daemon, Viserys' rogue brother. All of these primary characters were well cast, and the performances by Paddy Considine, Millie Alcock, and Matt Smith were all top notch. None of these characters were perfect people, but we were able to relate to and sympathize with them. Incidentally, Game of Thrones did a somewhat similar thing in their first season. It's essentially a family drama revolving around the Starks. The world then grew larger as seasons went on. The first Lord of the Rings film was also like this. While the characters were not all related by blood like the Starks and the Targaryens, the Fellowship of the Ring is about a group of people coming together for a common purpose, like a band of brothers. In contrast, the Rings of Power series introduced us to the elves, the dwarves, the humans in the Southlands, and the Harfoots, which are supposed to be one of the predecessors of the hobbits. There's a lot of friction and problems among these various groups, and while conflict is necessary in any story, it's very difficult to find many sympathetic characters across the broad canvas of this large world. About the only one I developed a real connection with was Durin. He wanted to help the elves, and he took a strong stand against his father's wishes to do so in a selfless and noble way. But the biggest problem in the series is the Harfoots. It's particularly disappointing because the hobbits were at the core of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Here, their predecessors are foolish and annoying, and not in the endearing way that Pippin and Merry were. It's so painfully bad that at points I felt like fast forwarding through their scenes. But I didn't do it, I still forged through, even though it felt like a high school play at points, or a Saturday Night Live skit. It's unbelievable that the hobbits descended from these Harfoots who have similar hair to Kramer on Seinfeld. And they look like they spend their days getting high in the woods and putting plants in their hair. Millie Alcock's excellent portrayal of Rhaenyra was one factor that really drew people in during the initial episodes of House of the Dragon. She had a strong screen presence, and you can see that Rhaenyra was a person who had the required fortitude and determination to one day be queen. The young Rhaenyra exudes a confidence and strength naturally. But in Rings of Power, Galadriel is just the opposite. They concocted these contrived scenes that make you cringe sometimes. It's all forced upon you in a heavy handed, poorly presented manner. At times, it's laughable. It doesn't help Rings of Power either that Kate Blanchett was so outstanding as Galadriel in the movies. Those are big shoes to fill. Speaking of which, their decision to cast an earlier version of Gandalf on the show was equally underwhelming after the iconic performance of Ian McKellen in the same role. And while it would be difficult for any actor to take up the mantle from Blanchett and McClellan, the performances that we see from the new actors struggle to even reach mediocrity. To be fair, some of it's the dialogue, like this classic line from the dollar store Gandalf.
I'm good.
Riveting stuff. It just reminds you of Gandalf from Lord of the Rings, doesn't it? On House of the Dragon, Even Caraxes had better lines. It's extremely difficult to reboot a franchise. Despite strong box office numbers for the Star Wars films, neither the prequels nor the sequels ever came close to matching the original trilogy with most of the audience. And this was a huge hurdle for the Rings of Power, particularly since the Lord of Rings trilogy is the height of modern cinema for any fantasy series. You can't just jump headfirst into such an undertaking like that. I think the outline of the story that they had was a decent one, the introduction of Sauron and the creation of Mordor, but they failed in the execution. The story itself moves slowly, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. One of my biggest criticisms of House of the Dragon's first season was that the pacing was a bit too fast at points. The problem for Rings of Power, though, was that the characters weren't that compelling or likable. So rather than doing world building during these initial episodes, you feel outside of the story much of the time, looking in and not as absorbed by the world as you do with House of the Dragon. In a recent interview with Howard Stern, Bruce Springsteen said something interesting about writing songs. To paraphrase him, he said that when he plays a guitar riff or writes lyrics, he can sense those moments in a song that will grab a hold of an audience and he feels the emotion they'll feel. And to me, that's the magic of great creative work, whether it's a song, novel, TV series, or film. And this is what the Rings of Power is missing. It plods along without any real power or inspiration. After episode 5, I was thinking about possibly quitting on it, but episode 6, which was their best one, gave me enough fuel to get to the finish line. Episode 6 was also the one with the large battle, and that action, which was largely well done, made up for some of the character and narrative deficiencies that have become embedded in the show. After watching the mind numbingly uninspiring Wheel of Time, which might actually be a hidden cure for insomnia, I was concerned about Rings of Power being on Prime too. They don't do fantasy very well. The creators of Rings of Power really bit off more than they can chew. And while I think they could mitigate some of the smaller issues in a second season, some problems are just too embedded. House of the Dragon is not a perfect series, but when you see how the Rings of Power failed, it really makes you appreciate what Ryan Condal and the rest of the creative talent accomplished in season 1. Not only did they have the failure of Game of Thrones finale on their back, but they also planned a season with some huge challenges before them. They had 4 time skips in the course of 10 episodes, 2 of them for large periods of time. 2 of the main characters, Rhaenyra and Alicent, had different actresses for the younger and older versions, plus there were a number of other characters for whom the actors were switched out as well. That's not an easy road to travel down when you're starting your series and trying to win back fans disillusioned by Game of Thrones. And while there were some uneven moments, overall they succeeded in delivering a high quality series that dominated the conversation on social media, even while Rings of Power was streaming episodes at the same time. Some people are calling the Rings of Power the worst TV series ever. That's a gross exaggeration. It's still spectacular looking visually. A lot of time and effort went into the production, and it's unfortunate to see that effort drowned by the casting and the execution of this story. After the first season concluded, the Rings of Power showrunner, Patrick McKay, said in an interview, "We had no idea what we were getting into. No one else did either." And that's a good place to leave this one. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button. And if you're not already, make sure you listen to Caraxes and subscribe. I want to thank everyone for watching, and I'll see you soon.